Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. Very happy that you're here. We're excited to be here also. We're going to be talking about cloud native drift, the roadblock for achieving architectural governance. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'm going to serve as your host and moderator, participating in our conversation. A few housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, so we'll be sending out a link after the webinar, or an email with a link, and also so you can download that, look at it later, listen to our webinar. Well, let's go ahead and begin. We like questions. We love questions from our audience, so we're going to be covering some of those during the webinar. And I'd like to introduce our speaker today. His name is Rod Johnson, CEO and founder of Atomist. Rod, welcome.
Hi, Mitch. Good to be here. Thank you.
Good to have you here. I'm excited to have this conversation, this webinar with you. We probably should start out just defining what cloud native drift is, what that means. Can you kind of set the problem, set the stage for us?
Yeah, I think this is a really big problem that we've been sleepwalking into over the last few years. So if you roll the clock back, say 10, 15 years, even large enterprises had a very small number of very large applications. So you'd go to a large enterprise, it would have a small number of multi-million line applications, probably written in Java. Today, even those kind of organizations that you would think of as maybe being a bit conservative are moving towards cloud native architecture. This means that instead of that handful of very large applications, they have hundreds, if not thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of smaller services. So these things are, typically in the hundreds or low thousands of lines of code. And there are a staggering number of them. So basically, the thesis of cloud native drift is that we are encountering a wholly new class of problem here, which is coherence, consistency among all those distinct applications. So cloud native drift is the problem that you get when they start getting out of sync, basically. So, you would, let's suppose you've got 1,000 applications, say 600 of them are using Spring Boot, 200 are using Node, and you've got a few other kinds of things. Ideally, you would want all your 600 Spring Boot apps to be on the current version of Spring Boot. Ideally, you'd want them to use the same version of any internal corporate libraries that you may have. Ideally, they would be using the same Docker base image for Java and exposing the same kind of ports in their Docker base images for the same kind of app. You would want the same delivery flow, essentially, on each app of the same type. But what happens in practice is these things get out of sync. I mean, another way I guess you could think of cloud native drift is the fact that things go rotten over time, right? Like even if you don't change an app, if you just let it sit there, it kind of goes off like the milk in your fridge, where, for example, something it uses became end of life. You've learnt that something that you did in that app is not fit for purpose and you fixed it someplace else. Drift is this gradual buildup of entropy where things get out of sync, they become inconsistent, and essentially, you encounter risk and loss of productivity for the organization.
I almost akin it to the wiring closet. The day you installed everything, the router, the switch, all the cabling, it looked great. But as soon as you close that door, all bets are off. It's gonna turn into chaos over time. And it's kind of what our environments are like, right? Because we don't spend all our time trying to keep it in perfect order, but requirements change, technology change, new teams, new people. There's a lot of things that are sort of teasing it apart a little bit at a time, sometimes in a big way. Is that a good description of it?
Yeah, I think that's a good description. I also think it's interesting that you mention people in the equation, because one of the reasons that you get inconsistency is because you have different people, different teams who may not know the best practice that was over there and the best practice that was over there. So, no single developer or even single team can be a domain expert on everything they have to touch. So, one of the things that you get over time is, say, this team creates a service, seems pretty good at that time. it's kind of gradually getting stale unless they keep it up to date. But then other teams create a service that may be better in a crucial respect. Maybe they're using a better security library. Maybe they've got a better build pipeline. But this app doesn't necessarily get updated. So that knowledge that is over here in the different team that we know more about setting up builds isn't necessarily flowing to other services. So, you know, an important element is essentially distributing knowledge across an organization.
I was just going to say knowledge sharing. You know, it seems like we're working in this environment where it used to be IT was one organization, kind of all things happened there, established what policies were not. Now we live in this world where credit card and whatever gets you cloud services and anybody can develop, but also we're architecting applications to be smaller and smaller components, but much, much, much larger numbers of those. So it is a more complex environment and it's a more dynamic where people can easily get out of drift or into drift, I guess, thinking about using the word the right way. It's sort of a natural phenomena that we're kind of fighting against, or is it a different way to look at this?
I think it's a natural phenomenon that we are fighting against. And I think we've just realized that we need to start fighting against it. Like I think in the early days of microservices, there was a fairly widespread belief that you let 1,000 flowers bloom and let your developers do all kinds of things and it would be great. And look, there is an element of truth in that. There's no question that it does foster innovation. So if your corporate standard is, I don't know, Node or Spring Boot or whatever, and somebody wants to be able to try, say, Go and see whether Go services are appropriate for some things, in a microservices cloud native environment, you can do that, right? You couldn't go and change your monolith from Java to Go, but you have that ability to innovate around the edges. So certainly there is an ability to innovate that should never be taken away or locked down. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people have discovered the cost of just letting things get chaotic, letting drift build up among similar services. One of the things that we see in our customers, for example, is getting off of Java 8, getting to the latest version of Java. And there are some libraries, old libraries, that don't let you do that if you're using them. So that, you know, if you have thousands of services, that suddenly becomes an immense problem where you can't get off a version that's going to be end of life because you've got these old usages that were never kept up to date. And of course, you've got drift in the sense that the new projects are not using those old versions. They're using the correct things. Another example of that is, say, in use of Python. You can, you know, we're seeing Python 2 is going to be end of life. So, you know, if companies who've let that drift accumulate in terms of the version of Python, that becomes costly. I think the interesting thing about drift is when you pay for it. I think the assumption that you never pay for it just doesn't hold up. It's just, what is the nature of paying for that debt? One way you pay for that debt is with security vulnerabilities. So imagine that you're a major version behind on something. It might be a library, it might be a Docker base image, it might be a range of things, a version of something like Spring Boot, or that, you know, ties many things together. Imagine you're a major version out of date in many of your repositories. Imagine that you want a new feature that's available in the latest release. If you're a major version out of date, you actually don't know how much work it's going to be able to run the current version, because something will probably break. Whereas if you gradually paid down that drift, kept things consistent, moved forward consistently, over that time, you'd be in a much better place. Another example, of course, is security vulnerabilities. Like, if old versions are more likely to be vulnerable to security breaches. So, you know, if you haven't kept up to date, there's a significantly higher risk that you're going to be exposed to something nasty. So, you know, essentially you can try to keep things consistent all along and kind of pay down that drift, or you can wait to pay when the check is presented. And you may not like how the check is presented.
Could be painful
Equifax
surgery.
really didn't like how that check was presented.
Wow,
So,
there's been a lot of incidents like that. You know, is this one of those take care of the details problems and the big things will take care of themselves, or is it pay attention to the big things and don't sweat the details? Which is sort of that macro micro approach to take when you're thinking about cloud native environments?
look, I think the dealing with drift, it's essentially around the kind of things that are tedious grunt work that developers don't want to do. So developers are excited about delivering new features. Developers are
Mhm.
excited about, fixing certain kinds of bugs. There are things that excite developers. Going and updating a bunch of Docker base images or Kubernetes memory settings or library versions, that doesn't excite them. So, I see this as kind of paying a continual tax, if you like, or insurance policy to ensure that check, being presented in a way you don't like. And that's why I think automation, frankly, is vital, because
Mhm.
these are the
Mhm.
kind of things that computers are good at.
So you
Like
get
humans,
consistency.
yeah, things that are completely boring and often routine are things that do not appeal to people. And computers are tireless doing those kind of things.
Hmm. Well, interesting. So, dive into a little bit more for us. What are the kinds of things that, how do you get yourself out of a bad situation or sort of you're out of control, get back into control? Or is there a set of things that you can tackle first? Kind of usually you talk like in football, right? It's blocking and tackling, deal with the fundamentals. Are there some of those things that apply to cloud native drift?
Look, I think the first thing is you need to understand what you have. So, kind of if you maybe think of it as an audit. So, what have we got across our organization? So, for example, how many different versions of our Docker base image for Java do we have?
Hmm.
How many different versions of, say, something like Spring Boot or Node do we have? How many different versions of a particular library do we have? How many different kind of logging formats are we emitting? So I think the first step is try to understand what you have at scale. And generally, our experience is that that's pretty scary, but it's the kind of thing which it's good to know. It may be slightly distressing when you see it, but you'll feel a whole lot better and you'll sleep a whole lot better when it's rectified. So I think step one is understand what you've got. And, I think you can do that to some degree via manual inspection, but automation is really important. With
Hmm.
Atomist, we have an open source project called Org Visualizer, which is available on our GitHub organization, Atomist Org Visualizer. And you can also sign into the Atomist free service. And if you're on GitHub, it will actually start to show like some of this, what you have in the organization. The second step is, try to put in place policies for dealing with it. So, for example, what targets do we have? Like, what version of a particular thing do we want to be on? Ideally, you want the ability to have automation putting out pull requests to gradually bring things up to that version. But of course, all this takes time, and in the enterprise, enterprises are always migrating from a number of things to a number of other things, right?
Hmm.
Nothing is ever, this is perfect, because that's not the world we live in. So it's, constantly a process of identifying and paying down debt.
Well, interesting. So I'd like to talk to you about the first thing, the first step you mentioned, that taking that inventory, understanding what you've got. Is that an ongoing process, a discovery process? Is it a point in time? What's the best approach to take when you're trying to get started down this path? And I appreciate you mentioned your visualizer to your open source project. I'm excited to hear more about that.
So, look, it's something that I think it makes sense for people to try first as a point in time exercise. So, they can simply download or clone the open source org visualizer, run it, and start to see what they have in their GitHub organization. But, I think if you recognize that this has value, it's vitally important to keep that information up to date. So for example, with the Atomist service, with every push to any project, it performs an analysis of that project so you can see, what is in there and relate it to other things. I find it personally surprising that there are not more tools that do this kind of overview thing, because I think it's really, really interesting. I think over time we've invested a lot in building infrastructure things around microservices, like, all the service mesh stuff, like circuit breakers. There's a whole bunch of things that lots of clever people have built out that help you succeed with the runtime of microservices at scale. But there really doesn't seem to be that much that deals with, like, understanding what's in your repositories and keeping it consistent.
Okay, good. So you mentioned a couple of steps. Are there some others that you would recommend?
So, look, I think that it's important for people to see what they've got and figure out what matters. So, for example, with that first step with org visualizer, it's easy to see the drift in things like NPM libraries or Maven libraries or Docker base images. But what I think makes a lot of sense is to actually ask questions: what is important to us? So typically in the enterprise, you will find that there are things that are not generic concerns that are unique. Like, for example, certain security policy files must be present. Maybe there needs to be some billing code included in a component that's emitting metrics. So, there are a bunch of concerns that in the enterprise are specific. And I think one of the things that's really important is understanding what you need policy for. And then think about it as a policy and governance problem, right? Like, essentially, the end result should be something like, well, we have a policy for using Spring Boot. We want to be on this version, which is like, I don't know, one back from the latest version or whatever it is. And we move that forward regularly. We have a policy for Docker base images. For Java, we use this one. For Node, we use this one. We have a policy that says that our own in-house proprietary custom security manifest needs to appear in each repository and needs to be validated. All these things I think make sense in terms of policy and governance. And I think really organizations should be more thoughtful about them than they often are. Because again, you don't want that unexpected check to be presented.
It's usually a big one. It is. We'll talk some more about maybe what some of the common mistakes are that people can make as they start to embark on this process. I mean, you could say, okay, let's go do an inventory. Let's go revisit and establish what policies we want. It sounds easy, but it sounds hard at the same time. Are there some best practices or mistakes people can steer clear of?
So I think to some degree it requires, there's a cultural element to this. One of our customers, large bank, their CIO talks about what he calls his socio-technical system of the thousands of developers in the bank. So, I think one of the first things is just opening people's eyes to what are we trying to accomplish here, and being very thoughtful about that. And you'll find that there are different stakeholders that want different things. So, for example, if you're a CIO, you don't want your company to be Equifax because you're not going to keep your job. If you're a senior manager, your concerns are probably also, fairly similar. You might be thinking, if you're a senior manager, you might be thinking also about productivity. That if our services are more consistent, we can, have better knowledge sharing, higher productivity. If you're a developer, you will probably think about it less in terms of governance and more in terms of convenience. So you'll probably be thinking, well, I'm not sure I care that much about the CIO's grand policy pronouncements, but on the other hand, I sure as hell don't want to be going around like manually updating libraries all the time. So, you know, any system that can do that for me, that's attractive to me. Also, I think one of the things that's very attractive to developers is knowledge sharing. Like, as I mentioned, knowledge is not equally distributed in an organization. And to some degree, drift reflects that unequal distribution. Because, you know, some projects are just better because the people behind them have up-to-date knowledge of a certain domain. So from the developer's point of view, actually benefiting from the up-to-date knowledge of their colleagues in a certain area is actually quite attractive. So yeah, I think reducing drift actually is a win for everybody in the organization, but the specific pros that they experience are somewhat different.
Okay, good. Would you apply the same things, you know, what you should do up front to kind of keep your environment managed to avoid a drift, or are there a different set of things you would recommend? How do you set yourself up for success?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I think the very first thing you need to do is ensure that you don't create drift on day one. Like it's lots of customers seem to refer internally to what they call day one and day two. Um, Day one is, for example, how you create new services. Like 15 years ago, we had like 5 multi-million line services. Every one of those was like a massive, you know, project to create. No one cared about creating services.
Hmm.
Now, when we often have thousands, new ones get created every day. So the first thing you want to do, day one, don't make the problem worse. The last thing you want to do is create a new service and instantly make your drift worse.
Mm-hmm.
So automating project creation and ensuring that you are always going to get a current best practices project for that technology set, very important. Secondly, day two, you know, keep things up to date once they exist. But I think, you know, I think that day one thing of don't make it worse at the get-go, that means you've really got to eliminate copy paste for creating new projects. Like
Hmm.
what people do, where very often they clone the service that seems most similar to what they want, they rename a bunch of stuff. That does not work well because the chances are that without any form of drift management, you're just making the problem worse instantly.
You're duplicating things rather
Yeah,
than creating new things. Is that the
yeah,
fundamental issue?
yeah, yeah. So look, I think automation is incredibly important to the solution. So you know, I think drift is a real problem. It's a dangerous problem. It hinders productivity, but you ideally need a pretty high level of automation to keep it under control, because you know developers have other things to focus on, and as I said, it doesn't appeal to people to do this kind of work, and they're not that great at it.
Hmm. Absolutely. You know, I think we're all a little bit like water. We'll kind of flow whatever path has the least resistance, right? So sometimes if you can automate through automation or just simplifying what you're doing and being able to manage it, that helps a lot. I'd love to hear a little bit. I know this isn't a webinar necessarily about Atomist, the products, but can you give us just a little bit of kind of teaser information about how you approach this as a product company, a solution to this problem?
So really, there's two elements to what we do. One is the open source project that I mentioned, Org Visualizer. The other is built into our cloud service. So essentially, if you sign into our cloud service and you connect your GitHub organization, Atomist can give you a view of what you've got and can start to pay down the drift around certain things, like, you know, dependencies for Maven or NPM, Spring Boot version, TypeScript version, Docker-based images, bunch of common things.
Hmm.
Where I think it gets even more interesting for enterprise users is they can customize what they do and write additional capabilities. So we have a very rich API in TypeScript that enables people to essentially identify different aspects for which drift concerns them, and even potentially automate the fixes. So Atomist does a bunch of things out of the box, but it's also an extensible platform where people can add their own policy capabilities and benefit from like visualizing the drift across that new aspect they identified, and also benefit from sending out PRs to rectify it. Good example of that might be, say, logging configuration, where an organization may want to be consistent about how it's configuring logging. It may be unique to that organization. The ability to ensure that that's kept consistent as well.
Very good. Appreciate that. When customers come to you, when you're talking to folks in the market, do they describe this as a drift problem? Are you easily able to identify, oh, great, we're the perfect company for you? Or do you have to kind of help tease apart their situation to say, okay, these are the symptoms, but the problem is this, and that's how we can help you? How does it manifest itself?
We generally find that when we talk about drift, it resonates with people. I mean, we've certainly heard cases where updating a particular major version of something literally took weeks, and was also a very unattractive activity for people to have to do, because no one wants to draw the short straw and be told that they're going to spend the next few weeks doing that. So yeah, generally there is what we hear is people really relate to the problem, but they typically have some point of particular pain for their own organization that immediately speaks to them. So for example, one organization, large organization we're working with, it's getting rid of the library usages that have them stuck on Java 8 in some of their services. So, that's something, that inconsistency in library usage is something that bothers them, and we're able to help them write custom aspects that use our platform to push out fixes. And where it's impossible to push out a fix, at least draw people's attention to the specific, hey, you've got a problem here. You better do something about
it. Okay, very good. I would imagine too, this is a topic area where the problem may have presented itself as we're concerned about, how many versions of Java or whatever we're running in our environment. And then once you really get engaged in it, you find out that may not actually be your biggest issue. There are 5 other things that we want to prioritize ahead of that. In other words, what you know about may be just the surface, kind of tip of the iceberg, if you will. Is that an experience that you frequently have with customers?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think, well, actually, the very first blog that I wrote about this direction for Atomist, Mitch, was called "This Will Surprise You," and it was based on analyzing some open source organizations. And yeah, typically, no one expects either the Spanish Inquisition or the things that have worse drift. One of the things that we do in our services, we actually rank the different aspects by the amount of drift. So, you will see quickly which things appear to be of greatest concern.
Very good. I'd love to, let's take some questions from our audience, if we can tap into that for a little bit. First question that comes up is drift specific to specific technologies, or can managing drift be custom? If you have one of these 3 technologies, you're definitely going to experience it, or is it kind of unique to different situations?
Really, I think drift applies across all technologies. So for example, if we think about library versions, we think, for example, about Docker-based images, if we think about Kubernetes specs, if we think about, say, AWS CloudFormation templates, just off the top of my head, those are things where all of them have the same problems of drift. So let's suppose we discover we want a slightly different memory setting for our node apps running in Kubernetes. That will be drift. If we've identified the correct setting somewhere and we've got like 200 projects that have the old settings, that's a painful example of drift. So it's not really technology specific at all. And one particularly interesting thing is that it intersects with GitOps. This whole idea of GitOps, I think, is very interesting, where the world is driven by Git. So that means that a lot of things where you experience drift actually directly affect your deployment. So it, to some degree, spans both development and operational concerns. I think the custom thing that is really interesting is where you find stuff that only matters to that particular organization, but may matter a great deal. So, for example, do we have the right kind of billing codes, say, that are specified in, this is a real customer scenario we've seen. They use a particular Spring Boot starter that exports metrics. They need to export those metrics along with information about the billing code so they can work out like internal billing allocation. So they need to ensure that there's configuration present in each project that has this correct setup and identifies the billing code. So there's a lot of things that with the Atomist platform, people can specify in custom code that are unique to their organization, but for which drift matters.
Interesting, really great. Let's jump on our next question here. When should we consider a mono repository versus many smaller repositories?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. That's another way of a totally different way of dealing with drift. And so, with the mono repo, you essentially, rather than have these hundreds of smaller projects and smaller distinct repositories, you try to shovel as much as possible into one repository and, try to force consistency within that. Look, people's views on this vary. It's inherently subjective. Some organizations like Google use mono repos. My personal take is the cost of a mono repo is very high. So the large organizations that use mono repos can't really use a lot of standard tooling. For example, Google have their own build system. Because standard, build systems like Maven don't really work with that well enough with that scale of repository. So I think it is a different way of dealing with drift, and it can help to handle the problem. But I think, frankly, the costs of it are so high in terms of, lack of ability to use standard tooling, less informative history in your source control system, potentially more complicated deployment. It's a very high cost way of addressing the same requirements. So I think really that the need for the mono repo, or the case for the mono repo, is substantially weakened when you have tools to manage drift across multiple repositories.
It seems it goes away from the idea of kind of innovation and supporting that and letting teams, kind of the thousand flowers idea, but you don't want to get out of control. Trying to centralize everything sounds like it's more cost effective or efficient, but doesn't necessarily means that it is, based on what you're saying.
Yep. Yeah, I think there are definitely costs to it. But I mean, I think it does reflect the fact that drift is a real problem and you need a strategy for dealing with it. So it's a strategy for dealing with it. And that's better than not having a strategy for dealing with it. So.
Well, speaking of which, I think this participant in the webinar may have been reading your mind here in real time. What happens if you ignore drift? What's the worst case? It sort of sounds like someone a really, why do I care, right? What happens if I don't do anything about it? Is it that big of a deal?
Look, I think, you might get lucky. It's a bit like having health insurance. Who knows? Maybe an individual doesn't need health insurance and they'll be totally fine and they'll save all this money on health insurance. The fact is, though, that I don't think many people would sleep in that scenario. So you don't really know when the check will be presented and you don't know what the nature will be. Obviously, the worst possible case is something like Equifax. They were using a very old version of the struts Java web framework that had a critical vulnerability. They'd successfully patched it in some other services, but not in the one that had the catastrophic breach. So the worst case is that things, as I said, they go off, they get rotten as they get older, and the worst case is that some bad guy is going to exploit that, and you have a really bad breach. Obviously, that doesn't happen that often, but nor does a serious car accident happen that often. But we all carry auto insurance, so the more likely thing that will happen is you will gradually see your productivity diminish because you can't do things consistently. You'll see that eventually you'll realize you need to upgrade, say, a particular service to get a new capability of the underlying platform like Node or Spring Boot or whatever. And you will suddenly discover that if you haven't upgraded the thing's version for 2 years, it's not easy to get to the current version. So, what you will discover is that your productivity is held back because you want to do something new that would be easy if you're in the current version. And it's like, better get there first. And that will take an unpredictable amount of time. So, realistically, I think the biggest loss in practice is this kind of inability to predict when you're going to have to, suddenly pay down debt. So when you're going to lose control of the schedule of when you're doing work, because suddenly you're going to have to bring something up to date. The other thing I think that really matters is kind of confusion. Like if you've got no consistency in how you're using things and you're moving, for example, individual developers around through different services, they're going to find that a little bit confusing, that certain things can be done over here, they can't be done over there.
Well, there's the adage of problems don't go away, they only get bigger, right?
Unfortunately, they do. And I mean, the funny thing about this one is that time creates problems, right? Like you don't actually even need to introduce bugs to your service. Gradually, over time, things are more likely to become vulnerable. They're more likely to be end of life. You're actually, with every passing day, you have a worse posture if you don't keep things up to date.
Great. Well, I think we've really done a great job of exploring this topic. And unless there's something else you want to hit on before we conclude.
No, thank you. Good to talk to you, Mitch. Fun discussion.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Rod, and of course appreciate our participants in the webinar and questions. If there's any that we didn't get to, we're happy to reach out individually on those. And of course, I'd like to thank our speaker today, Rod Johnson. You clearly have a lot of experience and both what the problem is and how to also address it. And I appreciate the approach that you're taking, starting with the kind of repo. With the open source also that you offer. So that's fantastic. So Rod Johnson, CEO and founder of Atomist, our speaker today. Just a reminder that we'll begin emailing everyone that's a participant with a link to download a recording. So I'd like to thank Rod and also thank you, your audience, for taking your time today out of your schedule to join us for this webinar. It's been my pleasure to be your host. Have a great day. Be careful out there.
Thank you.